Camila Matthews, 35, had always taken pride in being the glue that held her family together. Her days were filled with routines that any suburban housewife would recognize: school runs, grocery shopping, keeping the house in order, and ensuring that her husband, Luke Matthews, had everything he needed. Luke was a successful real estate agent, well known in Jacksonville for his charm and knack for closing deals. He often worked late, attending networking events or showing properties to clients, leaving Camila to manage the household and care for their two young children, Emma and Lucas. In 2008, tragedy struck the Matthews family when Gabriel Matthews, Luke's father, lost his wife to cancer. Gabriel had always been a stoic man, his years as a police officer teaching him to mask his emotions. But the loss of his wife left him shattered in ways that even he couldn't hide. He began spending more time at Luke and Camila's home, seeking the comfort of family to fill the void his wife's death had left behind. Camila, always compassionate, took it upon herself to be there for Gabriel. She would invite him over for dinner, make his favorite meals, and listen as he reminisced about his late wife. She saw it as her duty to support him, especially since Luke seemed to be growing distant, consumed by his work and the pressure of providing for the family. Gabriel, on the other hand, found solace in Camila's presence. The first time Gabriel looked at Camila with something other than fatherly affection, it caught him by surprise. It was a chilly evening in December 2009. When Camila had wrapped a blanket around Gabriel's shoulders as they sat on the porch after dinner, she had leaned in to adjust the blanket, and their eyes met. There was a spark, a moment of unspoken connection that neither could ignore. They quickly looked away, but the seed had been planted. Months passed, and the unspoken tension between them grew. Camila found herself looking forward to Gabriel's visits more than she should have. She would catch herself daydreaming about him, then quickly push the thoughts away, ashamed of the direction her mind was taking. Gabriel, too, was struggling. He knew it was wrong. Camila was his daughter-in-law, the mother of his grandchildren, but the feelings he had buried since his wife's death were resurfacing in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't until the spring of 2010 that things took a turn. One evening, after Luke had left for a business trip, Gabriel stayed late at the house, helping Camila fix a leaky faucet. The children were asleep and the house was quiet. As they worked together in the kitchen, their hands brushed against each other, and without thinking, Gabriel leaned in and kissed Camila. She pulled back, shocked, but the kiss had ignited something in both of them that couldn't be easily extinguished. That night, they didn't speak about what had happened, but the air was thick with tension. Gabriel left shortly after, but neither could forget the kiss. Over the next few weeks, they avoided each other, trying to pretend nothing had changed, but the pull between them was too strong. By the summer of 2010, they could no longer resist. Their encounters became more frequent, each one more daring than the last. They were careful, always meeting in places where they wouldn't be recognized. Gabriel's house when Luke was out of town, or secluded spots in the city where no one knew them. 4 years, they maintained the affair, each aware of the consequences but too deeply entangled to stop. Gabriel felt alive again, something he hadn't felt since his wife's death, and Camila found in Gabriel a comfort that Luke no longer provided. On March 2, 2014, Camila and Gabriel met at a motel on the outskirts of Jacksonville, a place they had discovered by chance a few months earlier. The motel was small, run down, and far enough from the city that they were unlikely to run into anyone they knew. They had been using it for their meetings, paying in cash, and using fake names to avoid leaving a paper trail. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set as Camila parked her car in the motel's gravel lot. She checked her phone one last time to make sure there were no missed calls or messages from Luke, then slipped the phone into her purse and stepped out of the car. Gabriel was already there, waiting for her. He had checked in earlier under the name John Smith, a name so common it was almost laughable, but it did the job. As Camila entered the room, Gabriel greeted her with a brief smile. But there was an underlying tension in his eyes. They had been meeting like this for years, but each time still carried the risk of being discovered. For a while, they talked about trivial things, how the kids were doing in school, Luke's latest real estate deals. But eventually the conversation turned to the affair. Gabriel had been thinking about ending it. Worried that they were pushing their luck, Camila too had her doubts, but the thought of losing Gabriel scared her more than the risk of being caught. She tried to convince him that they could keep going, that they were careful enough, but Gabriel wasn't so sure. After their meeting, Camila drove home, her mind racing. When she arrived home, she found Luke sitting in the living room, staring at the TV, but not really watching it. His expression was distant, and he barely acknowledged her when she walked in. Camila noticed the tension in his posture, the way his jaw was clenched, but she didn't press him about it. She assumed it was stress from work, unaware that Luke's suspicions had begun to take root, unbeknownst to Camila. Luke had noticed changes in her behavior over the past few months. She was more secretive, always making excuses to leave the house, and he had caught her on the phone a few times, quickly ending the call when he entered the room. Luke wasn't a man who jumped to conclusions, but the signs were there and he couldn't ignore them as Camila went through the motions of her evening routine, making dinner, helping the kids with their homework, getting them ready for bed. She tried to push her worries aside, but the nagging feeling persisted. A sense that everything she had worked so hard to hide was beginning to unravel. It was a typical Saturday afternoon when Luke Matthews stumbled upon the key that would shatter the illusion of his marriage. Camila had left her purse on the kitchen counter. While she was out in the garden with the kids, Luke, looking for some cash to pay the lawn care guy, reached into the purse and felt the cold, unfamiliar metal of a key. He pulled it out, puzzled by its appearance. The key wasn't one he recognized, certainly not for their home, car, or any other property he was aware of. Luke's mind began to race. Why would Camila have a key he didn't know about? A creeping suspicion that had been gnawing at him for months suddenly took root. He didn't confront her right away. Instead, he slipped the key into his pocket, deciding to investigate further before making any accusations. That evening, he was quieter than usual, watching Camila more closely as they went through their usual routines. Dinner with the kids, putting them to bed and then settling on the couch to watch TV. Camila didn't seem to notice the change in him, or if she did, she didn't let on. In the days that followed, Luke became increasingly paranoid. He started checking Camila's phone when she wasn't looking, scanning her messages for anything suspicious. But Camila was careful, deleting any incriminating texts or calls. The key, however, was a physical clue, something he could trace. On March 22, 2014, while Camila was out running errands, Luke took the key to a local locksmith. The locksmith, a man in his late 50s with a graying beard, examined it carefully. "This is for an older lock," he said, turning the key over in his hands. "Not something you'd find on a new property. Maybe a motel or an older building." Luke's heart sank. He thanked the locksmith and left, his mind now racing with dark possibilities. A motel key. Why would Camila have a motel key? The answer seemed obvious, but Luke needed proof. April 6, 2014. Camila and Gabriel had been meeting less frequently since Luke found the key, both of them growing increasingly wary of being caught. But the desire to see each other was too strong, and they arranged another meeting at the same motel they had been using for years. It was a rainy Sunday evening when they arrived, both tense and on edge. They sat at the small table, Gabriel fiddling with his wedding ring, a habit he had never been able to break even after his wife's death. Finally, Gabriel broke the silence, expressing the need to end the affair with Camila. He conveyed his concern, his voice low but firm, about the dangers they were courting. He emphasized that they were playing with fire and that it was only a matter of time. Before someone uncovered their secret, Camila, filled with fear, looked at Gabriel with wide eyes. She struggled with the idea of stopping the affair, expressing her deep care for him and her reluctance to lose what they had. Despite her feelings, Gabriel remained resolute. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache, and acknowledged that he cared about her, too. However, he pointed out the dangers involved, especially if Luke or the children were to find out. He reminded her that although they had been fortunate so far, luck could not be relied upon indefinitely. The conversation became heated, with Camila pleading for them to continue and Gabriel insisting that they stop before they destroyed their families. The tension between them was palpable, each of them battling their own desires against the reality of their situation. On April 10, 2014, Luke made the decision to hire a private investigator. He had never done anything like this before, but the doubt and suspicion gnawed at him day and night. The private investigator, a former cop named Tom Grayson, was known for his discretion and thoroughness. Luke met with him at a small diner on the edge of town, far from anyone who might recognize them. Tom listened carefully as Luke expressed his concerns, nodding as he took notes. Tom then informed Luke that he would need a week, possibly two, to gather the evidence Luke was seeking. He reassured Luke in a professional tone that if Camila was involved with someone else, they would uncover the truth. Luke handed over a manila envelope containing photos of Camila and a motel key, emphasizing his need to know the truth. His voice was strained, reflecting the weight of the situation. Tom accepted the envelope, assuring Luke that he would have the answers soon enough for the next week. Luke's anxiety intensified. He tried to act normal around Camila, but the tension between them was palpable. She noticed his odd behavior but chalked it up to stress from work, unaware that her every move was being monitored. On April 18, 2014, Tom delivered the evidence Luke had feared. Photographs of Camila and Gabriel, taken just days earlier, showed them entering the motel together. Luke's heart sank as he flipped through the images, each one a dagger to his already wounded pride. There was no denying it now. His wife was having an affair with his own father, but despite the rage boiling inside him, Luke kept his composure. He needed to think, to plan. Confronting Camila or Gabriel in the heat of the moment could lead to a disaster. The evening of May 2, 2014 was unusually quiet in the Matthews household. Luke had been holding on to his rage for weeks, waiting for the right moment to confront Camila. Dinner was a silent affair, with the children chatting about their day while Luke and Camila exchanged only the bare minimum of conversation. After the kids were tucked into bed, Luke decided it was time to confront Camila. He called her into the living room, his expression stern and unyielding. Camila, sensing something was wrong, sat down on the couch. Without hesitation, Luke pulled out the photos he had gathered and threw them onto the coffee table in front of her. His demand for an explanation was cold and controlled, leaving no room for denial. As Camila looked at the photos, the color drained from her face. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized how much Luke knew. She tried to speak, starting to explain, but Luke cut her off sharply. He made it clear that he didn't want to hear any justifications, demanding to know how long she had been sneaking around behind his back with his father. Camila broke down, sobbing as she confessed everything. She begged for forgiveness, swearing that she still loved Luke and that she had made a terrible mistake. But Luke was beyond hearing her words. He stormed out of the house. Leaving Camila alone with her guilt and fear, he drove for hours, his mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and a thirst for revenge. When he finally stopped, he found himself outside Gabriel's house. The sight of the familiar home filled him with rage. He pounded on the door, and when Gabriel answered, the confrontation erupted into a violent argument. Luke accused his father of the ultimate betrayal, and Gabriel, caught off guard, tried to defend himself. But Luke's anger was uncontrollable. The fight turned physical, with both men grappling before Luke finally left, vowing revenge. The fear that Luke might act on his threats haunted Camila. She had never seen him so enraged, and the memory of his outburst left her shaken. She confided in her closest friend, Sarah, a woman she had known since college. They met at a small cafe on May 15, 2014, where Camila poured out her heart, revealing the affair and the confrontation with Luke. Sarah was in shock as she processed what Camila had just told her, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. She urged Camila to leave, warning her that Luke was dangerous in his current state and that there was no way to predict what he might do. Camila, however, was torn. The idea of leaving Luke meant not only ending her marriage, but also uprooting her children's lives. She expressed her fear and uncertainty to Sarah, admitting that she was scared but didn't want to cause any harm to the kids. In response, Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Camila's hand, emphasizing the need for Camila to protect herself and her children. She stressed that if Luke was as angry as Camila described, she needed to be prepared for anything that might happen. Camila nodded, but deep down, she wasn't sure she could go through with it. She was trapped, paralyzed by her guilt and fear, unable to see a way out. Luke's anger festered, consuming him day by day. He couldn't shake the images of Camila and Gabriel together, and the more he thought about it, the more he wanted to make them both pay. By June 5, 2014, his thoughts had turned darker, and he began to meticulously plan his revenge. He purchased a gun from a shady dealer on the outskirts of town, a transaction that was quick and untraceable. Luke knew enough to cover his tracks to make sure there was no connection between him and the weapon. He stored the gun in a locked box in the garage, hidden beneath a pile of old tools and boxes that hadn't been touched. In years, each day, as he went through his normal routine, Luke's thoughts were consumed with the details of his plan. He rehearsed it in his mind repeatedly, envisioning every step, every possible scenario, until it felt like second nature. The day of reckoning finally arrived on June 18, 2014. Luke had waited for this moment, biding his time until he was certain Gabriel would be alone. That evening, after watching Gabriel enter his house alone, Luke decided it was time. He retrieved the gun from its hiding place, placing it carefully into a bag, along with a pair of gloves. As he drove to Gabriel's house, the gravity of what he was about to do pressed heavily on him. But it was drowned out by the overwhelming need for vengeance. Luke arrived at Gabriel's house just after 8 p.m. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the front yard. He parked a few houses down the street, far enough away to avoid drawing attention. With the gun concealed under his jacket, Luke approached the house using the spare key he had taken from Gabriel years ago. The lock clicked quietly as he turned the key, and he slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The house was quiet, the only sound coming from the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Luke moved silently through the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Gabriel sitting in the living room, reading a book, unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. Without hesitation, Luke stepped forward, pulling the gun from his jacket. Gabriel looked up, his eyes widening in shock as he recognized the figure standing before him. There was no time for words, no chance for explanations. Luke raised the gun and fired twice, the sound of the shots echoing through the empty house. Gabriel slumped back in his chair. The book falling from his hands as blood pooled beneath him, Luke stood there for a moment, staring at what he had done. The man who had once been his father was now a lifeless body before him. But there was no satisfaction in the act, only a cold, hollow feeling that settled in his chest. He quickly set about staging the scene, wiping down the gun and placing it in Gabriel's hand. Arranging the room to make it look like a struggle had taken place, Luke was meticulous, ensuring that nothing could link him to the crime. The next morning, Camila was at home preparing breakfast for the kids when there was a knock on the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, so the sound startled her. When she opened the door, 2 police officers stood on the porch, their expressions grave. The sight of their uniforms sent a wave of panic through her, and her mind raced with fear. "Mrs. Matthews," one of the officers asked, his tone gentle but serious. Camila confirmed, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry to inform you, but Gabriel Matthews was found dead in his home early this morning. It appears to have been a robbery gone wrong," the officer said. Watching her closely for a reaction, Camila's world seemed to tilt on its axis as the words sank in. She gasped, her knees buckling as she leaned against the doorframe for support. The officers moved quickly to steady her, helping her inside as the shock overwhelmed her. Camila couldn't speak, her mind reeling from the news, the police officers sensing her distress. Asked if there was someone they could call, but Camila just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. The realization that Gabriel was gone, that the man she had shared so much with was dead, was too much to bear. The investigation into Gabriel's death began immediately. The initial assessment by the police pointed to a botched robbery, but something about the scene didn't sit right with the lead detective, John Harris. He had known Gabriel from his days on the force and knew the man was no easy target. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. As the police interviewed friends and family, the truth about Camila's affair with Gabriel began to surface. It wasn't long before the private investigator's photos, which had been stored among Gabriel's belongings, were discovered by the detectives. The affair added a new layer of complexity to the case, and suddenly the robbery theory seemed less plausible. Luke was brought in for questioning on June 25, 2014. He had prepared himself for this moment, knowing that the police would eventually come knocking. His alibi was flimsy at best. He had been home alone on the night of the murder, with no one to corroborate his story. The detectives, sensing his discomfort, pressed him on the details, asking questions that Luke struggled to answer convincingly. When they searched his car and home, they found the gloves he had worn on the night of the murder, hidden away in the garage. The gloves, though cleaned, still had traces of gunpowder linking Luke to the crime. It was a small piece of evidence, but it was enough to crack Luke's carefully constructed facade. Faced with the mounting evidence, Luke's composure began to crumble. He denied everything at first, but the detectives kept pushing, methodically breaking down his defenses. The realization that he couldn't talk his way out of this began to dawn on him, and the truth of his actions weighed heavily on his mind. By July 3, 2014, the police had gathered enough evidence to arrest Luke on suspicion of murder. The once proud man who had been determined to exact revenge on his wife and father was now a broken figure, his face pale and haunted as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. He was charged with first-degree murder and held without bail, the gravity of his crime leaving him with little hope for the future. Camila, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The man she had once loved was now a murderer. Her father-in-law was dead, and the affair that had once seemed like an escape from her troubled marriage had led to unimaginable tragedy. She filed for divorce, determined to protect her children from the fallout of Luke's actions. Luke's trial began on August 15, 2014, with the prosecution presenting a strong case against him. The evidence was damning the affair. The gloves with gunpowder residue and the inconsistencies in his alibi all pointed to his guilt. The private investigator's photos were shown in court, painting a picture of a man driven to the edge by betrayal and jealousy. The defense tried to argue that Luke had been temporarily insane, that the affair had pushed him over the edge, but the jury was unconvinced. The cold, calculated manner in which Luke had carried out the murder left little room for sympathy. On September 10, 2014, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Luke was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his fate sealed by his own actions. As he was led away in handcuffs, Luke's once promising life lay in ruins. Destroyed by the very revenge he had so meticulously planned, Camila, devastated by the events that had unfolded, moved out of Jacksonville with her children. She sought a fresh start, hoping to leave behind the horrors of the past. But the memories of what had happened, the affair, the murder, the trial, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.